Marcus Wellington stepped out of his shiny black Mercedes and looked up at the fancy restaurant in front of him. The golden letters spelling Antonio's gleamed under the bright lights. This was the most expensive Italian restaurant in the whole city. Marcus straightened his expensive suit jacket and checked his gold watch. He was exactly on time as always. Tonight was the biggest night of his business life. 3 very important people from Japan were coming to dinner with him. These were not just any people. They were rich investors who could give his company millions of dollars. If they liked his ideas tonight, his tech company would expand to Japan and make him even richer than he already was. Marcus owned Wellington Tech, and everyone in the city knew his name. When he walked into rooms, people stopped talking and looked at him. He had worked hard to build his company from nothing. Now he had fancy offices, expensive cars, and more money than he could count. But tonight he felt something he did not like feeling. He felt nervous. The problem was simple but big. The 3 Japanese visitors could not speak English very well. Marcus could only say basic things in Japanese like hello, thank you, and goodbye. He had planned for his smart assistant Sarah to come with him tonight. Sarah spoke perfect Japanese and could translate everything. But 2 hours ago, Sarah called him. She was very sick and could not come. Marcus tried calling other people who could help him, but it was too late. Everyone was busy or could not come on such short notice. He thought about canceling the dinner, but that would look very bad. These investors had flown all the way from Tokyo just to meet him. If he canceled, they might never give him another chance. So here he was standing outside Antonio's, hoping somehow things would work out. Marcus was used to controlling everything in his business meetings. He always knew exactly what to say and when to say it. But tonight, he felt like he was walking into a room blindfolded. The restaurant door opened, and a man in a black suit came out to greet him. This was the manager who knew Marcus came here often. "Good evening, Mr. Wellington," the manager said with a big smile. "Your guests arrived 10 minutes ago. They are waiting at your usual table." Marcus felt his heart beat faster. The investors were already here. There was no turning back now. He followed the manager through the restaurant. Other people eating dinner looked up at him and whispered to each other. Some of them recognized him from newspapers and TV interviews. The restaurant was beautiful with dim lighting and soft music playing. Crystal glasses sparkled on white tablecloths. Fresh flowers sat on every table. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air. This was exactly the kind of place that should impress important business guests. But as Marcus walked toward his table, he saw the 3 Japanese visitors sitting quietly, looking confused. They were holding the Italian menus and talking to each other in Japanese. Even from far away, Marcus could see they looked lost and uncomfortable. Mr. Tanaka was an older man with gray hair wearing a dark blue suit. Nens Yamamoto was a woman in her 40s with a kind face but serious eyes. Mr. Sato was younger, maybe in his 30s, and kept checking his phone nervously. When they saw Marcus approaching, they all stood up and bowed politely. Marcus bowed back, but he could see the worry in their eyes. They tried to smile, but it was clear they were having trouble understanding anything without someone to help translate. Marcus sat down at the table and felt sweat on his forehead, even though the restaurant was cool. He had built $1 million company, but right now he felt completely helpless. The biggest deal of his life was about to fall apart before it even started. Marcus tried to smile as he sat down with the 3 Japanese investors, but inside he was panicking. The 4 of them looked at each other across the white tablecloth, not knowing what to say. Miss Tanaka picked up his menu and squinted at the Italian words. Ms. Yamamoto pointed at something on her menu and asked a question in Japanese. Mr. Seto nodded but looked just as confused as the others. Marcus opened his own menu and pretended to read it, even though he already knew what he wanted to order. He had eaten at Antonio's many times before. But tonight, the familiar Italian dishes seemed like they were written in a foreign language too. How could he explain what ossobuco was when he could barely say hello in Japanese? The silence at the table grew longer and more uncomfortable. Marcus could hear other people in the restaurant talking and laughing at their tables. The sound of clinking glasses and silverware seemed louder than usual. He felt like everyone was watching his table and waiting to see what would happen. Just then, a young man walked up to their table carrying a water pitcher and 4 glasses. He was wearing the standard restaurant uniform with a black vest over a crisp white shirt and a black tie. His name tag said David, and he looked to be around 30 years old. He had dark hair that was neatly combed and kind brown eyes behind simple glasses. David moved quietly and smoothly around the table, placing a water glass in front of each person. He filled each glass with ice water and set down cloth napkins. His movements were careful and professional, like he had done this thousands of times before. He did not rush or make any noise with the glasses. Marcus barely looked at the waiter. In his mind, David was just another college student working part-time to pay for school. Marcus had seen hundreds of waiters like this over the years. Young people trying to make ends meet while they figure out what to do with their lives. He assumed David probably studied something useless like art or music and would quit this job as soon as he graduated. While David was setting up their table, the Japanese investors started talking to each other again in their own language. Their voices were getting a little louder, and Marcus could tell they were becoming more frustrated. Mr. Tanaka kept pointing at different items on the menu and shaking his head. Ms. Yamamoto was looking around the restaurant as if she wanted to leave. Mr. Sato was checking his watch and frowning. Marcus felt his face getting red with embarrassment. These were very important people who had flown halfway around the world to meet with him. They probably thought he was completely unprepared and unprofessional. His reputation as a smart businessman was falling apart right in front of them. David finished setting up the table and stood quietly beside them, waiting to take their drink orders. He held a small notepad and pen in his hands. His expression was calm and patient, like he had all the time in the world. He did not seem bothered by the obvious tension at the table. The Japanese investors continued their worried conversation. Marcus caught a few words that sounded like they might be discussing whether to order drinks or just leave the restaurant entirely. He desperately wanted to say something to make them feel more comfortable, but every English phrase that came to his mind seemed useless. Marcus looked up at David, who was still waiting politely for them to be ready. The young waiter had no idea that he was watching $1 million business deal slowly falling apart. In David's world, this was probably just another table of customers who were taking a long time to decide what they wanted to drink. Marcus watched as the Japanese investors became more and more frustrated with each passing minute. Miss Tanaka was now speaking rapidly in Japanese while pointing at different sections of the menu. Ms. Yamamoto was nodding along, but her face showed she was just as confused as he was. Mr. Sato had put his menu down completely and was staring at his phone instead. The situation was getting worse by the second. Marcus could feel sweat forming on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning in the restaurant. This was supposed to be the most important business dinner of his career. Instead, it was turning into a complete disaster. He had spent weeks preparing his presentation about expanding to Japan. He had researched Japanese business culture and practiced his few Japanese phrases. But none of that mattered now because he could not even communicate basic information. Other people in the restaurant were starting to notice the problems at their table. Marcus saw a couple at a nearby table whispering and glancing over at them. An older woman eating alone kept looking their way with curious eyes. Even some of the restaurant staff seemed to be watching from across the room. Marcus felt his pride and his business deal slipping away at the same time. He was known throughout the city as a successful CEO who could handle any situation. But right now he felt completely helpless and stupid. The 3 most important business contacts he had ever met were sitting right in front of him, and he could not even ask them what they wanted to drink. David the waiter was still standing patiently beside their table with his notepad ready. He had been waiting for several minutes without complaining or showing any signs of impatience. His calm professional attitude only made Marcus feel more frustrated with his own inability to handle the situation. In a moment of desperation, mixed with his usual arrogance, Marcus turned toward David. He did not really expect the young waiter to be able to help him. But he was running out of options, and needed to do something before the investors decided to leave. Marcus looked up at David with a challenging expression on his face. His voice was louder than it needed to be when he spoke. "Hey waiter," he said in a tone that made several people at other tables turn to look. "You would not happen to speak Japanese, would you? I need someone to translate for my guests here." The way Marcus said it made it sound like he was asking something impossible and ridiculous. His tone suggested that he thought David was just a simple waiter who probably barely finished high school. Marcus expected David to shake his head apologetically and walk away. That would at least give Marcus an excuse to tell the investors that he had tried everything he could think of. The Japanese investors looked up at David with hopeful expressions on their faces. They had heard Marcus mention Japanese and translation. Even though they did not understand all the English words, they could tell that Marcus was asking the waiter for help with their language problem. Marcus crossed his arms and waited for David to admit that he could not help them. Then Marcus could suggest that they reschedule the dinner for another time when he could bring a proper translator. It would be embarrassing, but at least it would not be as bad as sitting through an entire meal without being able to communicate. But instead of shaking his head and walking away, David did something that Marcus never expected. The young waiter looked directly at the three Japanese investors with a respectful expression on his face. David looked at the three Japanese investors and did something that made Marcus feel like the world had suddenly turned upside down. The young waiter bowed slightly toward the guests and began speaking in perfect, clear Japanese. The words that came out of David's mouth were not the simple phrases that Marcus knew like hello and thank you. This was real Japanese spoken with confidence and perfect pronunciation. David's voice was respectful and professional as he addressed each of the investors by name. Mr. Tanaka's eyes went wide with surprise and delight. He immediately sat up straighter in his chair and began responding to David in rapid Japanese. His whole face changed from frustrated and confused to happy and relieved. It was like watching someone who had been lost in a foreign country suddenly find someone who could give them directions home. Ms. Yamamoto smiled for the first time since she had arrived at the restaurant. She joined the conversation with David, speaking quickly and enthusiastically. Her voice was animated and excited as she asked him questions and listened to his answers. The worry lines on her face disappeared completely. Mr. Sato put his phone away and leaned forward with interest. He began speaking to David as well, and even started laughing at something the waiter said. The three investors looked like completely different people than they had just moments before. Marcus sat frozen in his chair with his mouth hanging open. He could not believe what he was seeing and hearing. The young man he had assumed was just a college student working part-time was having a sophisticated conversation in perfect Japanese with his most important business contacts. David was not just saying basic words like yes and no. Marcus could hear complex sentences and business terms being discussed. The conversation flowed naturally, like David had been speaking Japanese his whole life. His accent was so good that he sounded almost like a native speaker. Other people in the restaurant were also staring at their table now. The couple nearby had stopped eating their dinner and were watching with amazement. The older woman alone was smiling and nodding approvingly. Even some of the restaurant staff had gathered near the kitchen door to watch what was happening. Marcus felt like he was in some kind of strange dream. Just minutes ago, he had been worried about his business deal falling apart because of language problems. Now his waiter was conducting the entire conversation that Marcus had been unable to have with his guests. The Japanese investors were not just talking about the menu anymore. Marcus could hear them asking questions about the local area and American business practices. David was answering everything with knowledge and confidence. He seemed to understand not just the language but also the cultural context of what they were discussing. David occasionally turned to Marcus to explain in English what the investors were saying. He translated their questions about the food and their dietary restrictions. He also explained some of their comments about the restaurant and the city. His English was just as perfect as his Japanese. Marcus realized that his assumptions about David had been completely wrong. This was not some random college student who happened to work at a restaurant. This was someone with real knowledge and skills that Marcus had never imagined possible. The power dynamic at the table had shifted in a way that Marcus found both surprising and uncomfortable. The three investors were now more interested in talking to David than they were in talking to him. They seemed to respect David's knowledge and appreciate his ability to communicate with them in their own language. For the first time in his successful business career, Marcus Wellington felt like the least important person at his own business dinner. The young waiter he had challenged with such arrogance was now the center of attention at the table. As David continued his conversation with the Japanese investors, Marcus began to notice something even more surprising. The discussion was not just about food and simple pleasantries. He could hear familiar business terms being mentioned in Japanese. Words like investment strategy, market analysis, and profit margins were being discussed with ease. Mr. Tanaka was asking detailed questions about the American technology market. David was answering with insights about industry trends and business opportunities. Nens Yamamoto wanted to know about local regulations and business laws. David explained complex legal concepts in ways that made the investors nod with understanding. Marcus felt more confused with each passing minute. How could a restaurant waiter know so much about business and finance? David was discussing topics that Marcus had studied for years in business school. The young man was giving advice about international trade and cultural differences between American and Japanese business practices. The investors were clearly impressed with David's knowledge. They were taking notes on small pieces of paper and asking follow-up questions about specific details. Mr. Sato even asked David for his opinion about the best ways to enter the American market. David gave thoughtful answers that showed deep understanding of both cultures. Marcus tried to join the conversation several times, but he felt completely left out. Even when David translated parts of the discussion into English, Marcus found himself struggling to keep up with the sophisticated business concepts being discussed. He was supposed to be the expert at this dinner, but David was demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond what Marcus had expected. The other restaurant customers were still watching their table with fascination. Word seemed to be spreading throughout the dining room about the waiter who spoke perfect Japanese. Marcus noticed the restaurant manager standing near the bar, watching the scene with a proud smile on his face. David made the investors laugh several times during their conversation. Marcus could tell from their body language that David was using appropriate humor and cultural references that the Japanese guests appreciated. This was not just language translation, but real cultural communication at a high level. When David finally turned back to Marcus to provide translation, Marcus felt overwhelmed by everything he was learning. The investors had been discussing not just the menu, but their entire business trip to America. They had concerns about cultural misunderstandings and questions about American business etiquette that David had been addressing with expertise. David explained that Mr. Tanaka was worried about making mistakes in American business meetings because he did not understand all the unwritten rules. Nens Yamamoto was concerned about the differences in communication styles between Japanese and American business people. Mr. Sato wanted to know about the best ways to build trust with American partners. Marcus realized that these were exactly the kinds of concerns he should have anticipated and prepared for. Instead, he had focused only on his own presentation and had not considered what the investors might be worried about. David seemed to understand their perspective better than Marcus understood his own potential business partners. The conversation continued for almost 30 minutes before they even ordered drinks. The Japanese investors were so engaged with David that they seemed to forget they were in a restaurant. They were treating him more like a business consultant than a waiter. Marcus watched in amazement as David gracefully managed to keep him included in the discussions while also providing the cultural bridge that the investors clearly needed. David would explain complex concepts to Marcus and then translate Marcus's responses back to the investors in ways that made sense in Japanese business culture. For the first time, Marcus began to wonder who David really was and how he had learned so much about international business and Japanese culture. During a brief pause in the conversation, when David went to get their drink orders, Marcus could not contain his curiosity any longer. When David returned with water and wine, Marcus quietly asked him how he had learned to speak Japanese so well. He tried to keep his voice low so the other restaurant customers would not overhear. David smiled modestly and explained his background in simple terms. He told Marcus that he had spent 5 years living and working in Tokyo. He had been employed by a major international consulting company that helped American businesses expand into Asian markets. His job required him to become completely fluent in Japanese and to understand both business cultures deeply. Marcus felt his assumptions about David crumbling with every word. This was not a college student working part-time to pay for school. This was a professional with years of international business experience. David had worked with companies much larger than Wellington Tech and had helped them navigate the complex world of Japanese business relationships. David explained that he had returned to his hometown 6 months ago because his parents were getting older and needed his help. His father had heart problems, and his mother was showing early signs of memory loss. As the only child, David felt responsible for taking care of them during their difficult time. He had taken the job at Antonio's while he decided what to do next in his career. The restaurant work gave him flexible hours so he could spend time with his parents during the day. He was considering his options for returning to international business, but family came first right now. When the Japanese investors overheard this conversation, they became even more interested in David. In Japanese culture, family loyalty and taking care of elderly parents is considered one of the highest virtues. They respected David even more for sacrificing his career to help his family. Ms. Tanaka asked David about his educational background. David mentioned that he had earned his MBA from Northwestern University with a focus on international business and Asian studies. He had also studied for a year at Waseda University in Tokyo to improve his language skills and cultural understanding. Ms. Yamamoto was impressed to learn that David had worked with several companies she knew in Japan. They had mutual contacts in the business world and began discussing people they both knew. David's reputation in Tokyo had been excellent, and he was still remembered fondly by his former colleagues. Ms. Shiseido asked David about his specific experience helping American companies succeed in Japan. David explained some of the projects he had worked on, including helping a software company establish distribution partnerships and assisting a manufacturing firm with cultural training for their executives. Marcus listened to all of this with growing amazement and embarrassment. Here was someone with exactly the kind of expertise that his own company needed for international expansion. David understood both the business and cultural sides of working with Japanese partners. He had real experience solving the exact problems that Marcus was trying to figure out. The irony was not lost on Marcus that he had been searching for months for someone to help him with his Japan expansion plans. He had interviewed expensive consultants and considered hiring international business experts. Meanwhile, the person with the perfect background and experience had been serving him dinner at his favorite restaurant. David remained humble throughout the conversation. He did not boast about his achievements or try to impress anyone with his credentials. He answered questions honestly and gave credit to his former colleagues and teachers for helping him learn. His modest attitude made the Japanese investors respect him even more. As the evening continued, Marcus realized that David was not just knowledgeable about business and language. He also had the kind of character and personality that Japanese business people valued. He was respectful, patient, and thoughtful in everything he said and did. As the main course arrived, Marcus noticed that the entire dynamic of the business dinner had changed completely. The Japanese investors were now directing most of their questions and comments to David rather than to him. They seemed more comfortable talking to David than they had ever been talking to Marcus. David managed the situation with impressive skill. He made sure to include Marcus in every conversation by translating everything and asking Marcus for his input on business decisions. But it was clear that the investors trusted David's judgment and valued his opinions more than they trusted Marcus. Mr. Tanaka asked David what he thought about the American technology market and whether it was a good time for Japanese companies to invest. David gave a thoughtful analysis of current trends and opportunities. He mentioned specific challenges that Japanese companies often faced when entering the American market and suggested ways to overcome them. Ms. Yamamoto wanted David's opinion about American business culture and how to avoid misunderstandings. David explained subtle differences in communication styles and business etiquette that could make or break international partnerships. He gave examples from his own experience of deals that succeeded or failed based on cultural awareness. Mr. Sato was particularly interested in David's insights about building long-term relationships with American business partners. David talked about the importance of trust and consistency in cross-cultural business relationships. He emphasized that successful international partnerships required patience and genuine respect for different ways of doing business. Marcus found himself in the strange position of learning about his own business culture from his waiter. David was explaining aspects of American business practices that Marcus had never really thought about. Things that seemed obvious to Marcus were actually quite different from Japanese business customs. The investors began asking David specific questions about Marcus's company and industry. David carefully directed these questions back to Marcus, but then helped translate and clarify Marcus's answers in ways that made sense to the Japanese visitors. David was essentially facilitating Marcus's own business presentation. What amazed Marcus most was how David managed to make him look good while also demonstrating his own expertise. David could have easily overshadowed Marcus completely, but instead he used his skills to help Marcus succeed. This showed a level of professionalism and character that Marcus had rarely seen in his business career. The other people in the restaurant were still watching their table with interest. Some had even moved to tables closer to theirs so they could observe the unusual dinner conversation. The restaurant staff seemed proud that one of their employees was impressing such important-looking business people. As dessert was served, the investors made it clear that they were very interested in moving forward with Marcus's business proposal, but they also made it clear that they wanted David to be involved in the project somehow. They felt that having someone with his cultural knowledge and language skills would be essential for success. Mr. Tanaka suggested that any business partnership should include cultural consulting services. Ms. Yamamoto mentioned that her company always worked better with American firms when they had proper cultural guidance. Mr. Sato directly asked if David might be available to work as a consultant on their joint ventures. Marcus watched in disbelief as his waiter received job offers from his own potential business partners. The three investors were more interested in hiring David than they seemed to be in working with Marcus himself. The tables had turned completely from the beginning of the evening. David handled these offers with the same grace and professionalism he had shown all night. He thanked the investors for their confidence in him and said he would certainly consider any opportunities they might offer. He also made sure to emphasize that Marcus was the real expert on the technology side of the business. By the end of the main course, Marcus realized that his business deal was not only saved, but was actually going better than he had ever hoped. The investors were excited about working with his company, and they had expanded their original investment offer significantly. By the time dessert and coffee were served, the Japanese investors had not only agreed to Marcus's original business proposal, but had expanded it far beyond what he had dared to hope for. What started as a simple investment discussion had grown into plans for a major partnership that would transform both companies. Mr. Tanaka explained that his company was so impressed with the cultural understanding they had experienced tonight that they wanted to invest twice as much money as originally planned. They felt confident that with proper cultural guidance, their partnership with Wellington Tech would be much more successful than other American ventures they had tried. Ms. Yamamoto suggested that they should start with a pilot program in 3 major Japanese cities instead of just one. She believed that David's insights about American business culture would help them avoid the mistakes that had caused problems in previous international partnerships. The expanded plan would mean millions more dollars in investment. Ms. Sato proposed that they should also consider bringing some of Marcus's technology products to other Asian markets like South Korea and Taiwan. He felt that with the right cultural consulting, they could build a network of partnerships throughout Asia. This would create opportunities that Marcus had never even considered. The 3 investors were so excited about their expanded plans that they began discussing details among themselves in rapid Japanese. David translated the key points for Marcus, who could barely believe what he was hearing. His company was about to become a major player in international markets. But the most surprising moment came when the investors turned their attention back to David. Mr. Tanaka spoke directly to him in Japanese for several minutes. Then David turned to Marcus with a slightly embarrassed expression on his face. "The investors have made me an offer," Marcus David said quietly. "They want me to work as their cultural consultant for all their American business ventures. They are offering me a position that would pay more than twice what I made in Tokyo." Marcus felt his jaw drop again. His waiter was being offered a job that probably paid more than Marcus made as CEO of his own company. The investors valued David's expertise so highly that they were willing to make him a central part of their American expansion strategy. Ms. Yamamoto added that they would also like David to help train their executives in American business culture before they moved to the United States. Ms. Shiseido mentioned that David could work from anywhere he wanted, including his hometown, so he could continue taking care of his parents. David listened to all the offers with genuine appreciation, but also with careful consideration. He thanked the investors multiple times for their confidence in him and their generous proposals. He explained that he would need some time to think about such important decisions. The investors completely understood his need to consider the offers carefully. They exchanged business cards with David and gave him their direct contact information. They told him to take as much time as he needed and to call them with any questions about the positions they were offering. Marcus watched this entire exchange with a mixture of amazement and respect. David was handling multiple job offers from major international companies with the same calm professionalism he had shown while serving dinner. He was not overwhelmed by the opportunities or eager to accept immediately. As the evening wound down, the investors made it clear that they considered David to be as important to their future success as Marcus and his technology company. They wanted both of them to be part of their expansion into American markets. The restaurant was beginning to empty as other customers finished their meals and left. But several people were still watching their table with curiosity. The story of the waiter who spoke perfect Japanese and impressed international business executives would probably be told in the restaurant for years to come. Marcus realized that he had witnessed something extraordinary. A young man who could have been bitter about having to leave his successful career to care for his parents had instead maintained his dignity and professionalism. David had turned a temporary job into an opportunity that could change his entire future. After the Japanese investors left the restaurant with promises to call both Marcus and David within the week, Marcus sat alone at the table trying to process everything that had happened. The evening that had started as his worst nightmare had turned into the most successful business dinner of his entire career. The restaurant was now quiet, with only a few other customers finishing their late dinners. The soft music and dim lighting that had seemed so stressful earlier now felt peaceful and calming. Marcus looked around at the familiar surroundings and realized that he would never see this place the same way again. David returned to the table to clear away the final dishes and coffee cups. He moved with the same quiet efficiency he had shown at the beginning of the evening. Nothing in his behavior suggested that he had just received job offers that could make him wealthy and successful. Marcus stopped David before he could walk away with the dishes. He looked up at the young man who had completely transformed his evening and his business prospects. For the first time in years, Marcus felt truly humble and grateful to another person. "David, I owe you an enormous apology," Marcus said quietly. "When I asked you to translate tonight, I was being arrogant and condescending. I assumed you were just a college student who could barely speak English properly. I never imagined that you had the kind of background and expertise that you do." David smiled and set the dishes back down on the table. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from Marcus. There was no judgment or anger in his expression, only understanding and kindness. "Mr. Wellington," David said, "I learned a long time ago not to judge people by their current circumstances. 6 months ago, I was wearing expensive suits and making important business decisions in Tokyo. Tonight I am wearing a waiter's uniform and serving dinner, but I am the same person with the same knowledge and skills." Marcus nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of David's words. He realized that he had made assumptions about David based on his job title and appearance without bothering to learn anything about him as a person. It was a mistake that could have cost him the biggest opportunity of his business career. David continued speaking in his calm, thoughtful way. I have learned that every person has a story and experiences that you cannot see from the outside. The businessman in the expensive suit might be struggling with problems you cannot imagine. The waitress serving your coffee might have advanced degrees and years of experience in fields you know nothing about. Marcus felt ashamed of his earlier behavior, but also grateful for the lesson he was learning. He had built his success on his ability to recognize opportunities and make smart decisions, but tonight he had almost missed the most valuable opportunity of his career because of his prejudices and assumptions. David, I would like to offer you a position with my company, Marcus said. Even if you decide to take one of the offers from the Japanese investors, I hope you will consider working with us on this expansion project. We need someone with your expertise and cultural knowledge. David thanked Marcus for the offer and promised to consider it along with the other opportunities. He mentioned that he would need to discuss everything with his parents and make sure any decision he made would still allow him to take care of them properly. As Marcus prepared to leave the restaurant, he realized that the evening had changed him in ways that went beyond business success. He had learned a valuable lesson about respecting other people and not making assumptions based on appearances or job titles. David had shown him that true professionalism and character were not about titles or paychecks, but about how you treat people and how you handle opportunities when they arise. The young man had turned a temporary setback into a chance to help others while maintaining his dignity and values. Marcus left Antonio's that night with a signed business deal worth millions of dollars. But more importantly, he left with a new understanding of leadership and respect for the people around him. He realized that success was not just about being smart or ambitious, but about recognizing and appreciating the talents and contributions of others. The experience had taught him that wisdom and ability could be found anywhere, often in the most unexpected places and people.